knife and keys. Can't help it any. It's always a curiosity to me when Kent calls up and says, oh, you want to come again, and gives me some date. And I'm always curious about why on earth would he ask me? You know, it's like, do you need the comic relief, or is it, hopefully it's...
I still don't understand how, we're just digging at the bottom of the barrel.
Ta-da! Okay. You got it.
That's not true.
It's always tough to try and figure out what I am going to talk about, because you know, if somebody asks me a question or somebody assigns a topic, you know what you've got. And when it's come and, well, what do you think? You know, do what you think is best. I have no idea what's best. So I have, the last few times I've come, I've kind of gone through some things that have been really important for us at Englewood Christian Church, where I am from. And so we've spent the last 3 years in Ephesians. Fortunately for you, it's only been one Sunday a year. So
I'm in Ephesians right now.
You're in Ephesians.
Yes.
Way to go. You finally made it. There's more. But I lost my notes, so I don't know where I was last year. So we're doing an office remodel. Everything's in topsy-turvy. I have no idea where my notes were. But there's other things that are important to us, and so I was kind of pondering what to do. And also, a couple of threads kind of came together in my head. I hope you'll forgive me if I wear my glasses like this, because I can see you if they're up here, and I can see my notes if they're down here. A couple of threads that have really gone through my mind in the last couple of weeks about this. One is we have a weekly conversation at Englewood. And last week we were in Philippians. No, we weren't. We were in Acts. It's nothing like Philippians. I don't know why I said that. And in Acts 15, I think, verses 3 and 4, Paul and Barnabas are sent by the churches where they are back to Jerusalem to talk about the issues confronting the Gentile Christians. And it says in 3 and 4, therefore, being sent on their way by the church, they were passing through both Phoenicia and Samaria, describing in detail the conversion of the Gentiles, and were bringing great joy to all the brethren. And when they arrived at Jerusalem, they were received by the church and the apostles and the elders, and they reported all that God had done with them. And I've really been intrigued as we've gone through Acts, because for two reasons. One is that God is really the actor in Acts. And it's really interesting to see. There's a lot of activity, but God is depicted as an actor. The second thing that I really appreciated about this passage right here is that Paul and Barnabas, as they go back to Jerusalem, they're describing in detail all that God has done with them. And as they get back to Jerusalem, they describe all that God has done with them. And I kind of reflected on that, and I don't know that I've ever told you anything about what I do, what we do, what Englewood does, kind of some of our own history, but reporting what God has done with us. And I don't know if you know anything about us at all, and it seems kind of odd because you get this stranger in here once a year with who knows what kind of history. So I thought it would be helpful if I would report to you some of what God has done with us. In the last 70 years, I guess. I've been there 70 years. That's the only thing I've got experience of, but especially more recently. But then also relative to the things that have been extremely important to us at Englewood in the last 25 or 30 years. So my text today is in John. In John 13, and there's a whole long passage here. I recommend that you read it all. I'm sure you do. But I'm just going to read a few verses here because they've been, like I say, important to us. The first verse says, Now, before the feast of the Passover, Jesus, knowing that his hour had come, that he should depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Verses 34 and 35. A new commandment, this is Jesus talking now, a new commandment I give you, that you love one another, even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. People ask me sometimes, they ask us at Inglewood, what scriptures are particularly important to us, what we're working on now, what we're finding new. And I generally go back to this, and I reply that, we started out 25 years ago working on loving one another, and we haven't really got that mastered yet, and as soon as we do, then we'll get to work on to the next one. But it seems like a really imperative here, a really important thing. Why that's so is because, Inglewood is a fairly old church. We were established in 1895, and like many churches, it comes from a tradition, pretty much the same tradition you all do. And we function in certain ways, and we have certain rituals and habits and practices that we follow. And sometimes it's hard to disrupt those and just listen to Jesus. But theoretically, we're followers of Jesus, not just our traditions. So Inglewood had a lot of different history. Inglewood had a history before World War II of being a very large and well-known neighborhood church. And Inglewood, the leadership at Inglewood was fundamental in starting some large national meetings among the Christian churches. And people, pastors, would aspire to come to Inglewood to be the minister there. After World War II, things changed pretty dramatically. They didn't change right overnight, but they changed. And Inglewood went through some of those changes. Inglewood got even larger than it had been. Was one of the largest Christian churches among Christian churches. I don't know what that means exactly. We had over 1,000 people on a Sunday, which was pretty good in the 60s and 70s. Very evangelistic, and lots of things were going on in the 60s and 70s. And churches weren't so much neighborhood churches anymore, and people were driving in from all over the city. And all kinds of people were coming in. So things were undergoing some dramatic changes. The 70s were a time of real turmoil in our Western society, and Inglewood felt that, and so went from a church of 1,000 with people driving in from all over to people leaving the neighborhood and leaving Inglewood, and but still maintaining kind of the traditions of Christian churches, and as fundamentalist churches became more evangelical, you were talking about evangelical churches losing some of the distinctives of being Christian churches, but more following the form of typical evangelical churches. Just lots of stresses. But one thing that we noticed by the time the 90s hit was that we didn't really see ourselves as a church. We saw ourselves more as a mission. We didn't see ourselves as really being sufficient to be an expression of Christ in the place that we were. We just saw ourselves as something less, but we also had some practices that were not particularly healthy. So by the time the 90s came along, we were very involved in doing pantries and relief type work. We had a building next door which we were instrumental in working with, and there was clothing pantries, food pantries. We gave away furniture. We did all kinds of things. But we did this all for strangers. We did this all for people that we did not have any idea who they were. And we got all this stuff from strangers. So we had some charismatic, well-known people in the church who could go out to outlying churches and say, here's what we do. Those people would give them stuff, furniture and clothing and all kinds of things. We built a warehouse. We built a big warehouse, and we put stuff in the warehouse, and we gave stuff away. But while we were doing this, we weren't really paying any attention to one another. You know, we had a fellowship. We had a church. We had people who claimed to love one another. I mean, we could get together and sing songs and hold hands and, you know, do the kumbaya thing, but really we didn't pay much attention to each other. So this was kind of aggravating, you know, for some of us, and others were just trying to survive. I mean, others were just trying to somehow find stuff to keep the doors open for another week or another month or another year. So sometime in the mid-90s, we started doing some things and saying, you know, we really need to do a better job of taking care of those God has given us, rather than just every person that wanders in the doors. Because when you start giving stuff away, and you give it away wholesale, people will beat a path to your door. There's no shortage of people who will want you to give them things. But most of that stuff, as you start evaluating it, was, you know, people would come for clothing and they'd go out into the alley and take off the clothes they had on, throw them down in the alley and put on the clothes they just got. Things like that. Or they would take furniture home when they already had furniture, but it, you know, they didn't like it anymore. There was all kinds of bad things that we were contributing to, and there were a lot of good things that we were not contributing to. So at some point in time, we started a ministry team called Englewood Community Development Ministry Team, or just the Community Development Ministry Team. And a ministry team is just a group of people in the church that get together and say, we need to do a better job of this. You know, so we might have a worship ministry team, and we have a missions ministry team, and we have a, you know, 10 or 11 or 12 ministry teams, and they've each got their own little domain, but we didn't have any ministry team that had anything to do with taking care of each other, which sometimes, if you read what Jesus said, seems almost fundamental. So from that, we started trying to learn to do a better job of paying attention to each other and caring for one another. And I'm using the word caring rather than loving, because a lot of times in churches, the word love is kind of like a code word that means, I don't know what it means. It means some kind of mushy, feel-good thing, but it doesn't mean anything really tangible. So we had to do something tangible. You know, all of our talk about love had to touch ground. It had to put on its work boots and get to work. So that's what we did. We didn't know what it would look like. I mean, it was new. I mean, who heard of people in churches ever taking care of each other? Well, they had done it for years. I mean, people had done it ad hoc, you know, just on their own, but it was never really seen as a part of being church to one another. So, at some point in time, we decided we had to do a better job. There were a lot of pressures. I guess one of the things that was going on about the time we were doing this was the city had various initiatives. There's always things going on, and we participate with the city in a lot of things, and it's been great over the last 25 years. But homeless initiatives are one thing, and work to welfare initiatives were a thing that was big back then. And so we really had to kind of examine ourselves and see what we were, you know, what we cared about, because we were involved in homeless stuff, but we weren't really involved in our own people's home situations. So it's nice to go out there and deal with this category, the homeless, but what was the situation that we had at Englewood? Well, we didn't really have any idea. I mean, we assumed everybody's fine, right? Because when you come to church, you assume that everybody's fine. And it would be rude to really inquire, because you don't want to butt into anybody's business. You know, you don't want to invade their privacy. So we started to talk about things like this. Do we have any kind? What do we have going on at Englewood? What's going on with our people? Well, we didn't know, but we kind of let the word get out that, you know, what we were about was really trying to learn to take care of each other, learning to love each other. What I want to do today is just tell you a few stories of what some of our attempts have been to learn to love one another at Englewood. I could tell you a lot more about what we do as Inglewood Community Development, but maybe some other time. But I just want to tell you about people, real people that we have, and perhaps people that you have, and what God has done with us. I don't want to draw any great lessons from any of these stories. I just want to tell you the stories of these people and let you make of them what you will. The first person I want to tell you about is Donna. And I tell you about Donna because she's the first person that when we said, well, we really want to take care of people better than we've done in the past. She was the first person who said, well, I need some help. And because we offered, if you need some help, let us know. So she did. Took a little while, but she came to us and said, I have to move. Can you help me move? Why, sure, we can help you move, because what does it take to help a lady move? Not much, right? Not much investment. Couple trucks, Saturday afternoon. So we asked her where she's going to move. Well, she doesn't know where she's going to move. She's mid-60s. She's recovering from cancer. She's living in a place that sits almost in a swamp. It's moldy. They've got to rehab the place she's in. It's got the lowest rent that she could find anywhere. She has nowhere to move to. She does have a son who's home with her that eats food and that type of thing, but doesn't really contribute. She has a husband who abandoned her 15 years prior and is not contributing to anything at all. So here's this lady who's recovering from cancer, may work a minimum wage job, has to move. We said, we care. We want to help. So what do? Well, we were real fortunate at Inglewood because we had some houses. Houses that we had planned to tear down so we could have a bigger auditorium and a bigger parking lot, because houses are a liability in cities, right? You have too many houses in a city, you have people in them, and rather have parking lots. So we were going to tear down these houses. Well, we had a house. We put her in one house, and we worked out an arrangement where she would keep paying the same she had paid all along, and while she's there, we would use the money that she paid to pay the taxes and the insurance, and the rest of the money would go into an escrow account for her. Meanwhile, we bought a house across the street from there, which had been boarded up for years and years, and it was owned by a local heating and air company. And we paid $6,000 for it, and I really was upset because I thought he ripped us off, and which is just one of those silly things. But we started working on that house, and we were going to fix it up for Donna to live in. And it was an old house. It was in pretty bad shape. It was the most substantial rehab probably I've ever done. And it was the first one. When we did this, this is a lot of conversation in the church for the church to buy a house, as you all know, and to say, we're going to rehab this and here's the human being that we're going to rehab it for. And Donna, being an older woman, had lots of older woman friends, and most of her older woman friends said, they'll never do that. Churches don't do that. They can't do that. And so she always had about half of her acquaintances in her ear saying, they'll never do that. They can't do that. Churches don't do that. And the other half of us saying, yeah, we're going to do it. When will it be done? I don't know, but it'll be done someday. And it took a long time. It was a full rehab. People in the church pitched in. I've got pictures of my father over there pulling dirty old stuff out. He looks like a homeless guy, dragging stuff out of this house. And I've got pictures of all kinds of people in the church doing that. But eventually, the house got done. It took 3 years. We were doing other things at the same time, but it took 3 years. And Donna got into her house. And it was a double, and she got to live in the backside of it. She got to pick whatever side she wanted to live in. So she lived in the backside, and when she did, she got a mortgage. And the front half of the double paid the mortgage. And so now Donna lives in then Donna lived in a brand new house, which she could never have imagined before, a house that had built specifically for her. She was living there free of charge because the front half of the house paid the mortgage. She had money in an escrow account, actual money. She had actual money. She'd never had savings before. She had like $12,000 in an escrow account. So this was an occasion. I mean, this was an occasion just in and of itself. She went and bought a red Pontiac. You know, it wasn't quite what we envisioned when we thought put it in an escrow account was go buy a nice car for yourself, but she did. And that was fine. It was her money, and it's her house. And we got paid back for all the expense. And it was a lot of work and a lot of investment on people's parts. But by doing that, we got into a relationship with each other and with Donna that we never would have had before. And we got to prove something about the quality of love. But then Donna, too, got to prove something about it. We had built it deliberately so that it had a bedroom and kind of a bedroom. But we didn't want to encourage her son to stay there indefinitely. So the kind of bedroom was more like a storage room, small, large closet or something. But at some point in the time while Donna was there, her husband got deathly ill. Her husband had abandoned her long before and had not contributed. And nobody liked her husband. He needed care. Nobody would care for him. But Donna took him in. And he stayed in her little spare bedroom for the remainder of his life. And so we got to participate in that. And we never would have done that if we had continued in the way that we were going at Inglewood, which was to say, I wish we could help you, but there's nothing we can do. There's everything we could do. Donna is now in a nursing facility. She has Alzheimer's. She remembers almost nothing. The only thing she really remembers is her house. And whenever anybody from the church goes to see her, she always wants them to take her home. So, and she means the house on Rural. Another story. Eleanor was an older woman than Donna, and Eleanor had been around Inglewood all her life, just like Donna had. A quiet person, unassuming, just kind of salt of the earth. They're always there. You think things are fine. You look at them, and everything looks like it's fine. And what could possibly be wrong? One day, Eleanor comes to us and said, I have to move. Where have we heard this story before? Okay, Eleanor, what's going on? Well, where I live now, they're telling me I have to move. I have to get out. And this was odd, Why do you have to get out? Well, they say there's too much noise and disruption coming from my apartment. Well, it's hard to imagine with Eleanor. Eleanor is an old woman. She worked in munitions factories in World War II. She'd always been a factory worker all her life. She had all of this time, all from World War II on, lived with her mother and her sister. And her mother and her sister took care of things like the house and the finances, and Eleanor took care of working and having an income. And so Eleanor knew nothing about taking care of finances and taking care of a house. And at some point in time, both her mother and her sister are gone. And Eleanor is alone. Do we know this at Inglewood? We don't. But Eleanor needs some help. And so there's a very accommodating lady that Eleanor met and who moved in with Eleanor to be her caretaker. And not only did this lady move in with Eleanor to be her caretaker, but she moved in her children and her children's children. And Eleanor had pretty good pension and Social Security and credit cards and checking account. And this lady, over a period of time with her children and her grandchildren, managed to empty all of her savings, her checking account, maxed out her credit cards, and applied for more credit cards in Eleanor's name, of course, because Eleanor had income. And I guess this lady had income too, named Eleanor. So all of this, we did move Eleanor. We moved her into a dump, and that was not good. But it was the only place that she could get into with this lady and her children and her credit history now. But we stayed involved with Eleanor, and it took a lot of work with banks and with credit agencies and with police to get things like that straightened up. We had a bookkeeper working for us named Carol. Carol had the unenviable task of trying to figure out Eleanor's finances. Eleanor's finances were a mess. But Carol's a bookkeeper. She can do this. And eventually, she kind of works through everything and figures out what's going on, where the money's going. Eleanor doesn't know that this woman is abusing her. Eleanor never really figured it out. And it took us about a year to convince Eleanor that this woman was abusing her, was taking advantage of her, and that if we were going to do anything about it, she would actually have to put her name on a piece of paper filing a complaint against this woman. Eventually that happened. We got that done. And so we got the negative part of that story kind of dealt with. We got the lady out of the way, the drains on her income out of the way, but also what we did is ask Eleanor if she has other family. You know, well, she does have other family. She has a brother who she would not dream of imposing on, of course, but we would dream of imposing on him. So, you know, which we did. And he's a good guy, you know, and his wife is a good lady, and they were happy to take Eleanor in. They wanted Eleanor to be with them. And so they asked Eleanor to live with them, and she came to live with them, and she was as happy as a clam. Not sure about how happy clams are, but you know, it's regardless, it's I mean, it was amazing, the transition in this lady, because she was completely beat up there for years, and she didn't know what was going on. And then everything had been lifted. Everything had been lifted, and she was with family, and it was good. Half a year after she moved in with them, they all packed up in a RV, went on vacation to the South, and while they were touring the South, I mean, she was looking forward to that, and it was great that she could go. And while they were touring the South, she died. She died in the RV in Alabama, just happy as a clam, and we were happy too, sorta. One more of our people. Of my friend Brian, who came to Inglewood sometime in the 70s. The 70s were a tough time for a lot of things, a lot of people, a lot of churches. They were a tough time for me personally. But by the end of the 70s, I had kind of a group of people that I was part of, and it was kind of an odd group of people. And Brian was one of the odd people that was part of this odd group of people, or a group of odd people, perhaps. I'm not sure which. So it was odd, let me tell you. We had all kinds of people, young people in that group. Brian had some difficulties. Brian has some difficulties. He was in his young 20s at the time. He'd had some kind of an accident, a serious accident when he was young, and it had affected his brain, and he had a steel plate in his head, and he had seizures. During church services, he would often have a seizure, and he would yell, and, you know, it made strangers a little uncomfortable. It probably made everybody a little uncomfortable, but it was just Brian, you know, and that's part of it. But Brian was part of our group, and we did lots of things together. Brian and I used to run together. Brian had a lot of energy. He walked a lot. So when something would trouble him, he would walk. And it was not unusual for him to walk from Irvington to Cumberland and then up north somewhere and then back. So he would walk miles and miles. He wouldn't walk over to the park and sit down. He would walk 15 miles. And that was great when he was young and energetic and everything was, his health was pretty okay, but it was never great. I mean, he never ate real well. He was a single guy. He lived in boarding houses, where you share a kitchen, you share a bathroom. But in those kind of places, people would take advantage of Brian. Brian always worked. He'd been able to have steady jobs. But his jobs had to be very, very routine. He had to be able to do the same thing every day, all the time, just the same way. And anything out of routine would just completely upset him. He couldn't function. At some point in time, as he was getting older and being able to live on his own and really glad that he could live on his own, he lost his job because the company that he worked for got bought by a larger firm, and they came in and all the jobs left and everything got mechanized and there was no longer any work for him. And so we tried to get him jobs at other places, and that's easy enough to do. You can always find a job, but we couldn't find a job like that one where he could go in every day, work at his station, do his thing, and then go home. He had to work around other people. And working around other people for people like Brian is really difficult because some people don't work real hard and some people aren't very nice, and Brian just couldn't function. And so he really couldn't keep those jobs very long, not because he wasn't a hard worker, but because working around people who didn't work like him just completely upset him such that he would have some kind of a outburst that would appear threatening. Also, while he's living in these rooming houses, people are taking advantage of him. He's got income, and it doesn't take long for people to find out who's got some money and find ways that they need some of that money and to convince that person with that money that really he could help them out. So Brian would help out his friends in these homes, in these boarding houses. And to the extent that Brian, of course, couldn't afford his rent anymore. We had, at the time, in the church, a young woman who was buying a house just real close to the church, and it had an upstairs apartment. And she needed somebody to live in that apartment. And so we thought, Brian, how about if you live in this apartment? You'll have your own bathroom. You'll have your own refrigerator. And so we talked him into moving into this apartment. While he was there, the young lady who lived downstairs and who was buying the house declared bankruptcy and left the house and stopped paying on it. But we kept taking Brian's rent because we were collecting his rent and putting it to her, but we started paying it to the mortgage holder. The mortgage holder was Indianapolis Neighborhood Housing Partnership. Some of you may know about them. So we kept paying, and we didn't know what we were going to do, but Brian, he's by then he's on disability. He's got an income of about $9,000 a year, but he's still paying his rent, and we're paying it to INHP. And after a period of time, we said to INHP, well, how about if we just sell this house to Brian? How about if you sell this house to Brian? Because he's been paying you all these months. Even though the owner of it declared bankruptcy and quit paying you, Brian's still paying you. And they said, well, okay, we can work something out. And we did work something out. So here's Brian upstairs in his apartment, and he's a proud homeowner now of a house on $9,000 a year. And that story in and of itself just kind of tickles me because the fact that if we care enough about each other, even somebody who makes $9,000 a year can be a homeowner. That's hard to imagine. That's really hard to imagine. But there you go. So Brian lived there for quite a while, owned the house. We tried we tried a variety of different things with him. He did better sometimes. He did worse sometimes. Eventually, his health became poor enough that he needed to move out of there. And we were able to buy the house back from him for substantially more than he had paid for it. And he moved into another building that we own that's a senior apartment building for people who make under 50% of area median income, which Brian certainly did. And so Brian lived there for a long time and was so happy there. It was the best place he'd ever lived, and he really, really liked it. Didn't walk much anymore, couldn't walk much, but he wasn't being taken advantage of anymore, and he had people around him who loved him and cared for him. Here recently, he's had to go into a more extended facility, more extended care facility. Had a real severe health issue a few months ago, but Brian is doing well. Brian's doing well, and it's good to see, because we could have said, well, you know, Brian, I wish there was something we could do, but there's really not. In the last 4 or 5 years, a couple in the church who are my age, who always had kind of a particular role in the church of driving things and leading things and instigating, being part of leadership teams, got involved with Brian. And that's been really good to see, because they're not trying to organize something or tell us how the church ought to run. What they're doing is they're really working with Brian, and they really care about him. And so not only seeing Brian in the last 5 years be alive, but seeing this couple in the church who, instead of trying to drive every activity that goes on, are actually trying to deal with their brother Brian, and the joy and the sense of purpose that has given them, because they're really good at it. They're really good at it. And they can do that. And they've got the time now because they're retired, and they can do doctor's appointments and just go visit with him and take him out to things and go places with him and pick him up for Sunday. So there's our brother Brian. And Brian's doing well. And all three of these people, I don't really want to try and draw any lessons or morals from any of these stories this morning. I mean, there are a lot that could be drawn. We could have not done any of those things. We could have used the typical excuses that we used to use for why we couldn't get involved with our brothers and sisters, but we chose not to. They were all really, really messy. I mean, it's really, really messy. It's real. I cannot begin to tell you how messy it is dealing with people. It's a lot easier to deal with programs. You know? Just get a program. If the people don't fit the program, get rid of the people. But we decided that what we really needed to do was forget about programs and just pay attention to the people. I will close here, and I will just read a little bit more from 1 John. You know, John's a case in and of himself. And I really appreciate it. You know, just the recording of that long speech by Jesus there in John 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. But seems so central to it is, a new commandment I leave you, that you love one another. I want to read a little bit from 1 John, just kind of some random, almost random verses. They're not really random, but they're in there. And they come to my mind a lot as I think about us trying to learn to love each other. In 1 John 3, 16 and 17, it says, "We know love by this, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brethren. But whoever has the world's goods and beholds his brother in need and closes his heart against him, how does the love of God abide in him?" Verse 23, "And this is his commandment, that we believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another, just as he commanded us." chapter 4, verses 7. Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God, and everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. 11 and 12 say, Beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. No one has beheld God at any time. If we love one another, God abides in us, and his love is perfected in us. 20 and 21. If someone says, I love God and hates his brother, he is a liar. For the one who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. And this commandment we have from him, that the one who loves God should love his brother also. That's the news from Englewood.